In 1954, the Mississippi River dropped so low that a town nobody had seen in decades rose from the water like a ghost. Foundations, remnants of streets, pieces of a settlement that had been swallowed whole by the river sometime after the Civil War, suddenly visible again, sitting in the mud, waiting to be photographed before the water came back. And it did come back. Within weeks, the river swallowed Prentiss again, and it has not resurfaced since. That alone would be a strange enough story for one video, but Prentiss is only the beginning. Today we are going to follow the Mississippi River from its old plantation towns to its ancient mound complexes, from cliff paintings that were destroyed before anyone could properly study them, to a mastodon skeleton found with human artifacts that may or may not prove what they appear to prove, to a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico so large it covers an area roughly the size of New Jersey. 6 discoveries, 6 different kinds of evidence, all connected to the same river, and every single one of them unsettled the researchers who found them. Let's start with the town that came back from the dead. Olivar County sits in the Mississippi Delta, that wide, flat expanse of alluvial land in the northwestern part of the state of Mississippi. Before the Civil War, this stretch of the river was an economic corridor. Cotton moved downriver, goods moved upriver, and the towns that sat on the riverbank existed because the river made them profitable. Prentiss was one of those towns. It served as a river port, a place where steamboats could stop, where cargo could be loaded and unloaded, where the commerce of the antebellum South passed through on its way to Vicksburg, Natchez, Memphis, and eventually New Orleans. Its position on the Mississippi was the entire reason it existed. But the Mississippi River is not a fixed line on a map. It never has been. The river moves. It carves new channels, abandons old ones, eats away at its banks, and deposits sediment miles from where it picked it up. Over centuries, the Mississippi has shifted its course across the floodplain like a slow-motion snake, leaving behind oxbow lakes, buried channels, and, sometimes, the remains of towns that bet their future on a riverbank that was never going to stay put. After the Civil War, Prentiss began to decline. The reasons were partly economic, the collapse of the plantation economy, the disruption of old trade networks, but the river itself played the most dramatic role. Erosion accelerated. The bank where Prentiss stood began to crumble. The Mississippi was literally undercutting the ground beneath the town. This was not unusual. Dozens of Mississippi River settlements have been lost to bank erosion over the past 2 centuries. The river does not need a catastrophic flood to destroy a town. It just needs time. Season after season, the current pulls sediment from the outer bend of a meander, and the bank retreats. Buildings that were once a safe distance from the water find themselves at the edge, then past the edge. Prentiss did not disappear in a single dramatic event. It was a slow drowning. Structures collapsed. Land fell into the river. What remained was gradually submerged as the channel shifted and the water covered what had once been dry ground. By the early 20th century, Old Prentiss was essentially gone. Locals knew it had existed. There were records, deeds, maps, but the physical town was underwater, invisible, buried beneath the brown current of the Mississippi. Then came the drought of 1954. That year, water levels across parts of the Mississippi dropped to extraordinary lows. The river shrank, sandbars expanded, and in Bolivar County, the receding water did something remarkable. It uncovered the remains of Old Prentiss. What emerged was not a perfectly preserved ghost town. Decades underwater had taken their toll. But there were foundations, there were structural remnants, there were recognizable traces of a human settlement that had been swallowed by the river and held beneath its surface for the better part of a century. People came to look, and, critically, people came with cameras. The photographs taken during the 1954 low water event are now preserved in the archives of Delta State University in Cleveland, Mississippi. They constitute a dedicated collection, images documenting the brief reappearance of a town that the river had consumed. These are not dramatized reconstructions or artists' impressions. They are straightforward photographs of ruins sitting in drying mud, taken during the narrow window when the water was low enough to expose them. The window did not last long. The river rose again, the ruins vanished, and Prentiss returned to its submerged state, where it remains today. There is nothing supernatural about this story. No curse, no ancient mystery, no unexplained force. The remarkable part is simpler than that. The Mississippi River is powerful enough to erase a town from the surface of the earth, hold it underwater for decades, briefly reveal it during an exceptional drought, and then take it back again. The river giveth, and the river literally taketh away. Those photographs in the Delta State Archives are now the primary visual evidence that the physical remains of Prentiss still existed in the middle of the 20th century. Whether they still exist today, whether the river has since scattered those foundations across the channel bottom, or whether they remain more or less in place beneath the water, is something no one has definitively established. A town built because of the river, destroyed because of the river, and temporarily returned by the river. That is the kind of story the Mississippi produces. But a sunken town is one thing. What happens when the river gives back something far older and far more controversial? About 1,000 kilometers upstream, and roughly half a century earlier, the Mississippi revealed something else entirely. In 1900, the water around a feature known as Mississippi River Island No. 35 dropped low enough to expose a skeleton. Not a human skeleton, something much larger, something that had been dead for thousands of years. It was a mastodon. Mastodons are extinct relatives of modern elephants. They roamed North America during the Pleistocene epoch and disappeared roughly 10 to 11,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, depending on the region and the dating method. Finding mastodon remains in Mississippi River sediments was not, by itself, extraordinary. The river cuts through deposits that span tens of thousands of years. Bones surface from time to time when the water drops or the banks erode. What made the island No. 35 discovery different was what else was reportedly found near the skeleton. Two artifacts, objects that appeared to be of human manufacture, were recovered in apparent association with the mastodon bones. If the association was genuine, if humans had truly been present at the same site at the same time as a living mastodon, the implications were enormous. In 1900, the timeline of human presence in North America was still being debated, and evidence of humans coexisting with Pleistocene megafauna was rare, contested, and scientifically explosive. The discovery attracted enough attention to receive dedicated discussion in American Antiquity, one of the most important archaeological journals in the United States. Researchers examined the claim, they debated the evidence, and then the problem started. The core issue was context. In archaeology, context is everything. It is not enough to find two objects near each other. You need to demonstrate that they were deposited at the same time in the same undisturbed layer of sediment under conditions that rule out later mixing. An arrowhead found next to a dinosaur bone does not prove that humans hunted dinosaurs. Not if the arrowhead could have washed into the same spot 10,000 years later, or if a collector placed them together, or if river erosion churned up material from completely different time periods and redeposited it in a single jumbled layer. This is precisely the problem with the island No. 35 mastodon. The bones were real, the artifacts were real, but the association, the claim that they belonged together, that they represented a single moment in time when a human being and a mastodon occupied the same place, was not documented with enough precision to withstand serious scrutiny. The site was not excavated by trained archaeologists using modern stratigraphic methods. The exact positions of the artifacts relative to the bones were not recorded with the kind of detail that would allow later researchers to evaluate whether the context was genuinely undisturbed. The sediments were river deposits, which are notoriously unreliable for preserving clean stratigraphic layers. Rivers move things. They pick up objects from one location and drop them somewhere else. They mix old material with new material. They create false associations that look convincing on the surface, but fall apart under analysis. Later researchers treated the claimed human mastodon association at island No. 35 with increasing caution. Not because the idea was impossible, we now know that humans and mastodons did overlap in North America, but because this particular site could not provide the proof. And that is the genuinely frustrating part. The evidence exists, the bones are real, the artifacts are real. The possibility that they were found together in a meaningful way is real. But the circumstances of the discovery, the lack of precise documentation, the nature of river-deposited sediments, the absence of controlled excavation, mean that the one thing researchers actually need to confirm, the undisturbed association, is the one thing they cannot verify. This is not a rare problem in archaeology. It is, in fact, one of the most common. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary documentation. When the documentation is missing, the claim hangs in a kind of scientific limbo, not disproven, but not provable either. The mastodon from island No. 35 remains in that limbo, a tantalizing possibility that the river revealed and that the river's own chaotic geology may have permanently obscured. If you think about it, there is something almost cruel about that. The Mississippi uncovers a find that could rewrite a piece of North American prehistory, and at the same time, the Mississippi's own nature, its constant churning, its reworking of sediments, is exactly what prevents anyone from trusting what it uncovered. But lost evidence is not always the river's fault. Sometimes, humans destroy it themselves. In 1673, two French explorers, Jacques Marquette, a Jesuit missionary, and Louis Joliet, a fur trader and cartographer, were paddling down the Mississippi River through what is now the state of Illinois. They were among the first Europeans to travel this stretch of the river, and they were recording everything they saw. Near the area that would eventually become the city of Alton, Illinois, they looked up at a limestone bluff above the water and saw something that stopped them. Painted on the cliff face were two enormous figures. Marquette described them in his journal. The creatures were large, brightly colored, and depicted in a style he found both impressive and unsettling. He noted details about the faces, the bodies, the tails. He compared their size to that of a calf. He described scales and antlers. He remarked that the quality of the painting was high enough that he doubted European artists of his acquaintance could have done better on such a surface. What Marquette did not describe were wings. This is important because later depictions of the creature, which eventually became known as the piazza bird, almost universally include large, bat-like wings as one of the defining features. The winged version is the one that appears on modern murals, tourist materials, and popular illustrations. It is the image most people associate with the piazza legend, but the earliest surviving European account, the one closest in time to the actual observation of the original rock art, does not mention wings at all. What happened between Marquette's description and the winged creature of later tradition is a textbook case of how images mutate across retellings. Later writers added details. Artists interpreted the description through their own aesthetic lenses. Local legends grew around the figures, attaching narratives about flying creatures, aerial predators, and monstrous birds that may or may not have had any connection to what the original artists intended. Each retelling drifted a little further from the source, and here is where the story becomes genuinely tragic from an archaeological perspective. The original cliff, the actual limestone bluff that held the original painted figures, was destroyed. Quarrying operations in the 19th century blasted away the rock face. The paintings were obliterated. The surface they were painted on no longer exists. Think about what that means. Modern researchers cannot go back and examine the original art. They cannot photograph it with high-resolution cameras. They cannot analyze the pigments. They cannot use dating techniques on the paint or the rock surface. They cannot compare the actual figures with Marquette's description to determine how accurate his account was. They cannot identify the artistic tradition the figures belong to, establish how old they were, or determine whether they were painted all at once or modified over time. All of that information, every bit of it, was destroyed when the cliff was quarried. Not lost, not buried, not waiting to be rediscovered, destroyed. What survives are written descriptions from European observers who saw the paintings before they were obliterated, plus a long chain of later reproductions, each one filtered through the assumptions and artistic conventions of its time. The piazza bird that people recognize today is a creature of accumulated reinterpretation, not a faithful reproduction of the original rock art. The genuine mystery here has nothing to do with whether a flying monster once terrorized the Mississippi Valley. The mystery is about the art itself. Who created those figures? What culture did they belong to? What did the images mean to the people who painted them? How old were they? Were they connected to other known traditions of indigenous rock art in the region? These are real questions, and they are questions that may never be answered because the primary evidence, the painted cliff, was turned into gravel. This is one of archaeology's most uncomfortable realities. People tend to imagine that the past is simply waiting to be found, buried neatly underground, preserved by time. But that is not always the case. Sometimes the evidence is not hidden, it is gone, quarried, paved over, bulldozed, flooded, or dynamited before anyone thought to record it properly. The Piazza Cliff is a permanent reminder that archaeological evidence is not renewable. Once it is destroyed, no amount of future technology can bring it back. What do you think was actually on that cliff? A depiction of a real animal, exaggerated by artistic convention? A mythological figure from a tradition we no longer have access to? Something else entirely? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is one of those cases where we are all working with the same incomplete evidence. Now, everything we have discussed so far involves things the river uncovered, or things that were destroyed before they could be studied. The next story is about something that was pulled out of the ground, deliberately, extensively, and without permission. Sometime in the 1960s, a man named Leonard Charrier found something near the Mississippi River in Louisiana. Charrier was a prison guard by profession and a self-described treasure hunter by passion. He had been searching for old sites in the area, and he located the remains of a Tunica settlement and its associated cemetery. The Tunica were an indigenous people who had lived along the Mississippi and its tributaries for centuries. By the early 18th century, they were deeply enmeshed in the colonial world that had arrived with French, English, and Spanish exploration. They traded, they allied with some European groups, and fought others. They navigated an increasingly dangerous geopolitical landscape while maintaining their own identity, their own governance, and their own cultural practices. When Tunica people died, they were buried with objects. Some of those objects were traditional, ceramics made in indigenous styles, tools, personal items. But many of the objects were European in origin: guns, metal tools, glass bottles, brass kettles, cloth, and, in staggering quantities, glass trade beads. What Charrier found was not a handful of artifacts, it was an enormous assemblage. The collection that eventually emerged from the site included more than 200,000 European trade beads alone. That number is worth pausing on. 200,000 individual beads, each one a small glass object manufactured in Europe, shipped across the Atlantic, traded through colonial networks, acquired by Tunica people, and ultimately placed in graves alongside the dead. The beads alone tell a story of connection, exchange, and entanglement that stretched from glassmaking workshops in Venice or Amsterdam to burial grounds along the Mississippi. But they were far from the only objects. The collection included weapons, jewelry, ceramics of both indigenous and European manufacture, metal implements, and a wide range of other items that together formed one of the most important archaeological assemblages ever recovered from the southeastern United States. The problem was how it was recovered. Charrier did not conduct a scientific excavation. He dug for treasure. He removed objects from graves without systematically recording where each item was found, what layer of soil it came from, what other objects were next to it, or how the burial was arranged. He was after the things themselves, not the information encoded in their positions. This distinction matters enormously. In archaeology, an object removed from its context loses most of its scientific value. A European musket found in an indigenous grave can tell you that trade occurred, but a European musket found in a specific position within a specific burial, next to specific other objects, in a specific layer of a cemetery that can be dated and compared with other burials in the same cemetery, that can tell you far more. It can tell you about the status of the person buried, about the period when the burial occurred, about changing trade relationships, about ritual practices, about how European goods were integrated into indigenous life and death. When objects are ripped from the ground without that documentation, the information is destroyed. Not temporarily misplaced, destroyed. You cannot reconstruct the context after the fact. You cannot put the dirt back and re-excavate. The act of uncontrolled digging permanently eliminates data that no future technology can recover. Charrier's excavation of the Tunica site caused exactly this kind of damage. The objects survived, but the relationships between them, the spatial data, the stratigraphic associations, the burial patterns, were largely lost. And then came the legal battle. The question of who owned the artifacts became the subject of prolonged litigation. Charrier claimed ownership as the person who had found and excavated them. The Tunica Biloxi tribe argued that the objects had been taken from the graves of their ancestors and belonged to them. The case worked its way through the courts and became a significant moment in the broader legal and ethical struggle over indigenous cultural heritage in the United States. The question was not just about property law. It was about who has the right to the belongings of the dead, about whether finding something gives you ownership of it, and about the obligations that exist when human remains and sacred objects are involved. Ultimately, the courts ruled in favor of the Tunica Biloxi tribe. The collection was returned. Today it is held and managed by the tribe, and it is recognized as one of the most significant collections of its kind from the colonial era southeast. The artifacts remain scientifically valuable, even without their original context. The sheer scale of the collection, the range of European and indigenous objects, the volume of trade beads, the mixture of cultural traditions, provides irreplaceable evidence about the complexity of indigenous European interaction along the Mississippi during the 18th century. But the lost context is a wound that does not heal. Every question that could have been answered by careful excavation, questions about individual burials, about change over time within the cemetery, about the specific combinations of objects placed with specific people, those questions are now permanently unanswerable. The Tunica treasure, as the collection came to be known, is both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph because the objects survived and were ultimately returned to the people whose ancestors created and used them. A tragedy because the way they were removed from the ground destroyed information that can never be reconstructed. If this kind of story grabs you, the collision of archaeology, law, ethics, and the complicated history of the Mississippi, then subscribe to this channel because we keep finding stories like this and they keep getting more uncomfortable. Now let's follow the Mississippi to its end. Not to a town, not to a burial ground, not to a cliff, to the open ocean. The Mississippi River drains roughly 40% of the continental United States. Think about that for a moment. Rain that falls in Montana, in Ohio, in New York State, in Minnesota, in the Appalachian Mountains, water from 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces eventually finds its way into the Mississippi or one of its tributaries. The watershed covers approximately 3.2 million square kilometers. That is larger than India. Everything that enters the water upstream, every dissolved chemical, every particle of soil, every molecule of fertilizer that washes off a farm field, rides the current south. The river collects it all. And it delivers it all to one place, the northern Gulf of Mexico, where the Mississippi and its major distributary, the Atchafalaya River, pour their combined load into the sea. What arrives is not just water and sediment, it is nutrients. Enormous quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus, primarily from agricultural fertilizer, but also from wastewater, urban runoff, and atmospheric deposition. These nutrients are not toxic in the traditional sense. They are, in fact, the same elements that make crops grow. Nitrogen and phosphorus are essential for life. The problem is quantity and location. When these nutrients hit the warm, sunlit waters of the Gulf, they do exactly what they do on a farm field. They make things grow. Specifically, they fuel massive blooms of algae, microscopic photosynthetic organisms that explode in population when given abundant nutrients, warm temperatures, and light. While the algae are alive, the system looks productive, even lush. But algal blooms do not last forever. The algae die, they sink, and when they reach the bottom, they become food for bacteria. Bacteria decompose the dead algae, and in doing so, they consume dissolved oxygen from the surrounding water. This is the same basic biological process that happens in a compost pile, except it is happening in the ocean across a vast area, consuming oxygen that fish, shrimp, crabs, and every other oxygen-dependent organism needs to survive. Under normal conditions, the ocean replaces dissolved oxygen through mixing. Wind stirs the surface, waves churn, currents bring oxygenated water down from above. But in the northern Gulf of Mexico during summer, something prevents that mixing. The fresh water pouring out of the Mississippi is less dense than the salt water beneath it. It spreads across the surface in a layer, and this density difference creates a physical barrier, a stratification of the water column that prevents the oxygen-rich surface water from mixing down to the bottom. The result is a phenomenon scientists call hypoxia. Dissolved oxygen concentrations drop so low that most marine animals cannot survive. Fish and shrimp that can swim will flee the area. Organisms that cannot move, bottom-dwelling invertebrates, worms, sessile creatures, may simply die. This is the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. It is not a permanent feature. It forms seasonally, typically reaching its maximum extent in mid to late summer, when river discharge is high, nutrient loads are heavy, water temperatures are warm, and stratification is strong. By fall, cooling temperatures, storms, and changing currents usually break up the stratification and allow oxygen levels to recover. But during its peak, the dead zone can be enormous. In recent years, it has covered areas ranging from roughly 13,000 to over 22,000 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, 22,000 square kilometers is roughly the area of New Jersey. Imagine an area the size of an entire U.S. state where the water near the bottom contains so little oxygen that most complex life simply cannot exist. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, coordinates annual surveys to measure the extent of the dead zone. Research vessels cruise the Gulf, lowering instruments that measure dissolved oxygen concentrations at various depths. The data is compiled into maps showing where oxygen levels fall below the critical threshold of 2 milligrams per liter, the standard definition of hypoxia. The size of the dead zone varies dramatically from year to year, and predicting it is not straightforward. A wet spring in the Midwest, with heavy rains washing large amounts of fertilizer off fields and into streams, will send a bigger nutrient pulse down the river and tend to produce a larger dead zone. A dry year will produce a smaller one. But hurricanes can temporarily break up the stratification and shrink the zone. Wind patterns, ocean currents, and the timing of storms all play roles. The summer of 2026, like every summer before it, brought a new round of measurements. NOAA and collaborating scientists conducted surveys to map the zone, measure oxygen levels, and compare the results with predictions based on spring nutrient loads. The mechanism is well understood, the cause is well identified, the scale is well documented, and yet the dead zone persists year after year because the underlying driver, the flow of agricultural nutrients from the vast Mississippi watershed into the Gulf, has not been fundamentally changed. There is nothing mystical about it, no sea monster, no curse, just chemistry, biology, and the consequences of what happens when a river system draining 40% of a continent delivers the residue of industrial agriculture to a single stretch of ocean. The unsettling part is the scale. One river system, fed by the runoff from millions of square kilometers of farmland, can alter the chemistry of thousands of square kilometers of sea, every single summer. And now, from the end of the Mississippi's journey, let's go back to its beginning. Not the beginning of the river's course, but something much older, the beginning of monumental construction in the Americas. In northeastern Louisiana, in a landscape of low ridges and floodplain forests within the broader Mississippi drainage basin, there is an arrangement of earthen mounds that does not look particularly dramatic from the ground. 11 mounds, connected by low ridges, forming a rough oval. The tallest mound rises about 7.5 meters, roughly the height of a two-story house. The entire complex spans about 370 meters across. It is called Watson Break, and for most of the 20th century, nobody realized what it was. The mounds were on private land. They were covered in vegetation. They did not look like anything that would force a rethinking of North American prehistory. Local people knew the mounds were there. The property had been used for farming and forestry, but the earthworks were not investigated by professional archaeologists until relatively late. When researchers finally examined Watson Break systematically, they discovered that the mounds were not natural formations. They were constructed, deliberately built, layer by layer, over an extended period of time. Soil had been carried, deposited, shaped, and added to in multiple construction episodes. This was not by itself a shocking finding. The American Southeast has hundreds of mound sites. Poverty Point, not far from Watson Break, is a spectacular complex of earthworks that was already well known. Mound building was an established part of the region's archaeological record. The shock came from the radiocarbon dates. When samples from Watson Break were dated, the results pushed the construction back to approximately 3400 BCE, roughly 5,400 years before the present. That was nearly 2,000 years older than Poverty Point. It was older than the Egyptian pyramids. It was older than Stonehenge. When the dates were published, Watson Break became the oldest known surviving complex of monumental earthworks in the Americas. The age alone would have been significant, but the identity of the builders made the discovery even more important. The people who constructed Watson Break were not farmers. They did not grow corn or squash or any of the domesticated crops that later sustained large settled populations in eastern North America. They were hunter-gatherers, mobile communities who lived by fishing, hunting, and collecting wild plant foods, particularly the abundant resources of the Mississippi floodplain and its surrounding forests. This was a problem for existing archaeological models. The conventional understanding of monumental construction, the one taught in textbooks and assumed in most archaeological interpretations, went roughly like this. First, people develop agriculture. Agriculture produces food surpluses. Surpluses allow some people to stop producing food and instead organize, manage, and direct the labor of others. Centralized leadership emerges. That leadership mobilizes large workforces, and those workforces build monumental architecture: pyramids, temples, earthworks, stone circles. Watson Brake broke that sequence. Here was a monumental complex, 11 mounds, connected ridges, a large-scale designed landscape, built by people who had none of those supposedly necessary preconditions. No agriculture, no stored surpluses in the traditional sense, no evidence of the kind of hierarchical political organization that was supposed to be required. The archaeologist Joe Saunders, who led much of the early research at Watson Brake, and his colleagues faced the task of explaining how this was possible. How did mobile hunter-gatherer communities organize the repeated, sustained effort required to build 11 mounds over what appears to have been several centuries of construction? The answer, or at least the emerging interpretation, involved rethinking what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of. The Mississippi floodplain and its surrounding environment were extraordinarily rich in resources. Fish, shellfish, deer, waterfowl, nuts, and other wild foods were abundant and, in many cases, seasonally predictable. Communities did not need agriculture to assemble in large numbers at certain times of year. The natural productivity of the landscape could have supported periodic gatherings large enough to carry out construction work. But that still leaves open the question of motivation. Why build the mounds? What were they for? This is where the evidence becomes thin. No written records exist, obviously. The artifacts recovered from Watson Brake do not clearly indicate a single function. The mounds may have served ceremonial purposes, social purposes, territorial purposes, or some combination. They may have been gathering places, ritual spaces, or markers of identity. Different mounds within the complex may have served different functions. What researchers can say is that the construction was not random. The arrangement of the mounds, the oval layout, the connecting ridges, the relationship between the mounds and the surrounding landscape shows planning. This was not a pile of dirt that grew accidentally. It was a designed space, built incrementally over a long period by people who returned to the site again and again to add to what their predecessors had started. The lesser-known dimension of Watson Brake is what it implies about time. The construction was not a single event. The radiocarbon dates suggest that the mound-building activity spanned several hundred years. That means the project was not the vision of a single leader or a single generation. It was sustained across many lifetimes. People who began the work did not live to see it completed. People who added to the mounds inherited the project from ancestors who had started it centuries earlier. For a mobile hunter-gatherer society to maintain a construction project across that kind of timescale, there must have been some mechanism, social, ritual, cultural, for transmitting the commitment from one generation to the next. What that mechanism was, we do not know. We have the physical evidence of the mounds. We have the dates. We have the environmental context. But the social glue that held the project together across centuries is invisible in the archaeological record. Watson Brake remains one of the most important archaeological sites in North America, and one of the least understood. Its age rewrote the timeline of monumental construction in the Americas. Its builders challenged the assumption that monumentality requires agriculture and hierarchy. And the questions it raises, about social organization, about motivation, about cultural continuity over deep time, remain largely unanswered. That is 6 stories. A town swallowed and returned by the river. A mastodon found with artifacts whose association may never be proven. Indigenous rock art destroyed before modern science could reach it. An enormous burial collection ripped from the ground and fought over in court. A dead zone the size of a state created by the chemical residue of an entire continent's agriculture. And a complex of earthen mounds so old that it forced archaeologists to rethink what hunter-gatherer societies could accomplish. Every one of these stories is connected to the Mississippi, and every one of them, in its own way, is about the same thing: the collision between what we think we know and what the evidence actually shows. The Mississippi is not just a river, it is a system, hydrological, ecological, geological, historical, that has shaped this continent for millennia. It builds land and destroys it. It preserves evidence and scrambles it. It feeds the Gulf of Mexico and suffocates it. It carried the commerce of empires and buried their remains in its sediment. And it is not done. The river is still moving, still eroding, still depositing, still flooding, still dropping low enough in dry years to reveal things that have been hidden for decades or centuries. The next drought, the next flood, the next shift in the channel could expose something that no one has seen before, or destroy something that was waiting to be found. If this video made you rethink what a single river can do to the history, archaeology, and ecology of an entire continent, share it with someone who would find it as unsettling as you did. And tell me in the comments, which of these 6 discoveries surprised you the most? The town that came back? The dead zone? The earthworks that are older than the pyramids? I want to know. Because the Mississippi has not finished revealing its secrets, and it has not finished hiding them either.